The rain in Connecticut during the month of October does not just fall, it punishes. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of gray, heavy day that makes the bones of an old woman ache before the first drop even hits the pavement. I was driving my silver sedan down the I-95, heading home after a long shift of volunteering at the local clinic in Ridgefield. My hands, calloused from 40 years of nursing, gripped the steering wheel with a familiar steadiness. I was 65 years old, and for the first time in my life, I felt I had finally earned the peace that waited for me at the end of the road. My house, a beautiful craftsman-style home nestled on a quiet acre of land, was more than just wood and stone. It was my sanctuary. It was the physical manifestation of every double shift I had ever pulled, every holiday I had missed, and every penny I had pinched while raising my son Julian on my own. I remember the lights first. They were blinding white-hot orbs that shattered the darkness of the storm. A massive semi-truck, its trailer fishtailing on the slick asphalt, crossed the median like a predatory beast. There was no time to scream. There was only the visceral sound of metal screaming against metal, the explosive pop of the airbag, and then a cold, creeping silence. As the world faded into a hazy red blur, my last thought was not of my own life. It was of Julian. I hoped he knew where I kept the spare key to the safe deposit box. I hoped he wouldn't forget to water the hydrangeas I had planted in the front yard. Then the darkness swallowed me whole. For 4 months, I lived in the void. It was not a dreamless sleep. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. I could feel the ghost of voices drifting above me like autumn leaves on a pond, but I could not reach out and catch them. I heard the rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. I felt the cold, impersonal touch of latex gloves. Sometimes I felt a hand on mine. It was warm, familiar, and slightly trembling. Julian, I would think, though my lips would not move. Stay with me, Julian. But then the warmth would vanish, replaced by a sharp clicking sound of high heels on the linoleum floor. Vanessa, my daughter-in-law. Her voice was always too loud, always dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl, even in my unconscious state. The day I finally opened my eyes, the light felt like needles stabbing into my brain. The hospital room was sterile, white, and smelled of bleach and lingering despair. I tried to move my hand, but it felt like it was made of lead. My throat was a desert, parched and raw. I turned my head slowly, my neck cracking with the effort, and saw him. Julian was sitting in a plastic chair by the window, staring at his phone. He looked older, his face was drawn, his eyes underscored by dark, bruised circles. He looked like a man who had been carrying a heavy burden. But as I watched him, I realized with a sting of pain that it wasn't the burden of grief. It was the burden of guilt. I made a small croaking sound. Julian froze. He looked up, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and something that looked terrifyingly like disappointment. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't cry out in joy. He stood up slowly, as if he were approaching a ghost. "Mother," he whispered, "you're awake." I tried to speak, but only a dry rasp emerged. "Water," I finally managed to say. He poured a cup of lukewarm water and held the straw to my lips. I drank greedily, the liquid reviving the fire in my chest. "How long?" I whispered. "For months," Julian said, his voice flat. "It has been 4 months since the accident, Maggie. The doctors said you had severe brain swelling. They told us you might never wake up. They told us you were essentially gone." I looked at him, searching for the boy I had raised. I had worked 3 jobs to put him through the best architecture school in the country. I had gone without new clothes for a decade, so he could have the latest computer software. I had been his mother and his father, his protector and his provider. But the man standing before me wouldn't even meet my eyes. "Where is Vanessa?" I asked. Julian shifted his weight. "She is at the house," he said. "She is busy. There has been a lot of change. Mother, you have to understand. We had to make decisions. Hard decisions." A cold chill that had nothing to do with the hospital air began to settle in my stomach. "What decisions, Julian?" Before he could answer, the door swung open. Vanessa walked in, looking radiant in a designer trench coat that must have cost $3,000. She was holding a latte, and a leather handbag. I recognized immediately. It was mine, a vintage piece I had kept in my closet for special occasions. She saw me awake and didn't even flinch. She plastered a bright, fake smile on her face and walked over, kissing the air near my cheek. "Maggie, look at you rising from the dead," she chirped. "We truly thought you were a goner. The doctors were so certain." "It is a miracle, isn't it, Julian?" "Vanessa," I rasped, my eyes fixed on my handbag. "Why are you carrying my bag?" Vanessa laughed. A sharp metallic sound. "Oh, this. Maggie, we had to clear out the master suite. We couldn't just let things sit there and rot. We thought you wouldn't need it anymore. We thought we were honoring your memory by putting things to use. Clear out the master suite." My heart began to hammer against my ribs. "What are you talking about? Who is in my house?" Julian looked at the floor. Vanessa took a long sip of her latte, her eyes gleaming with a predatory satisfaction. "Maggie, look at the reality," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of condescending pity. "You were in a coma. Your medical bills were mounting. The insurance was a nightmare. We had to think about the future of the family. My parents, Frank and Brenda, were struggling with their mortgage. They lost their place in the city. And since your house was just sitting there empty, a $600,000 asset going to waste. Well, we made the logical choice." "The logical choice?" I repeated the words, tasting like ash. "We transferred the deed, Maggie," Vanessa said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "Julian and I have the power of attorney. We decided it was best for everyone if my parents moved in. They've been there for 3 months now. They have redecorated. It looks much more modern now, less like a dusty museum." I looked at Julian. "My son, my Julian." He remained silent, his shoulders hunched, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Julian, tell me she's lying," I begged. "Tell me you didn't give away my home. The home I built for us." "Mother," Julian finally said, and his voice was so weak, it made me want to weep. "We thought you were dying. The Whitmans needed a place. Vanessa said it was the only way to keep the family together. We thought we were doing the right thing." "The right thing?" I screamed, though it came out as a broken wail. "You gave my house to her parents while I was still breathing. You took my clothes, my jewelry, my memories, and handed them to strangers." "They aren't strangers, Maggie," Vanessa snapped. "They are family. Unlike you, they have actually been supportive of Julian's career. Besides, you can't live there anymore. You are a liability. You need constant care. We have already made arrangements for your next step." "My next step," I whispered. "The doctors are discharging you tomorrow," Vanessa said, checking her gold watch. "We have found a lovely facility for you. The Silver Pines. It is specialized for people with your condition. It is quiet, secure, and very affordable. We have already moved the last of your personal items there. Just the essentials, of course." I knew of Silver Pines. It was a gray, decaying building on the edge of town, a place where the forgotten went to wait for the end. It was a warehouse for the dying. "Julian, please," I gasped. "Don't let her do this. Take me home. I can recover. I am a nurse. I know how to heal." Julian finally looked at me, and I saw the truth. He was terrified of her. He was so hollowed out by her manipulation that there was nothing left of the son I knew. "Vanessa is right, Mother," he said, his voice trembling. "You need professional help. We can't handle you. And the Whitmans, they are settled in. We can't just kick them out. It would be cruel." "Full?" I whispered. "You think it would be cruel to kick them out of my house, but it is not cruel to throw your mother into a gutter." Vanessa walked to the door, tapping her nails against her latte cup. "We will see you tomorrow for the transfer, Maggie. Try to get some rest. You look exhausted." They walked out, leaving me alone in the sterile white room. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I looked at my hands. They were thin, the skin translucent, shaking with a fury that was slowly replacing the shock. I was 65 years old. I had $100 in my bedside drawer and nothing else in the world. My son had sold my soul for his wife's approval. The next day, the transfer was handled with the efficiency of a business transaction. 2 orderlies loaded me into a transport van. Julian didn't show up. Only Vanessa was there, standing on the sidewalk in her expensive heels, waving a gloved hand as the doors closed. The drive to Silver Pines was a blur of gray Connecticut roads and dead leaves. When we arrived, my heart sank. The building was worse than the rumors. The paint was peeling, the windows were grimy, and the air inside smelled of stale urine and industrial floor cleaner. I was wheeled into a room I had to share with 3 other women. My bed was narrow, the mattress lumpy and thin. On the small metal nightstand sat a single photograph in a cracked frame. It was a picture of Julian as a little boy holding a trophy from his first soccer game. It was the only thing they had brought from my house. For weeks, I sat by the window of that miserable room. I watched the seasons change from a brutal autumn into a biting snowy winter. My body began to heal, but my spirit was in a state of cold, calculated hibernation. I did the physical therapy. I ate the bland gray food. I listened to the moans of the dying around me. And every day I looked toward the direction of my home. Julian visited once a month. He would sit on the edge of my bed, never staying longer than 15 minutes. He would talk about the weather, about his new projects at the firm, about how happy Vanessa was now that her parents were settled. He never asked how I was. He never looked at the bruises on my arms from the rough handling of the overworked staff. One afternoon I asked him, "Julian, have you seen my garden?" He blinked, looking confused. "The garden? Oh, Frank had the whole thing ripped out. Mother, he said it was too much maintenance. He put in a large gravel pit for his truck and a shed for his tools. Vanessa said it looks much cleaner now." I felt a sharp stabbing pain in my heart. Those hydrangeas had been a gift from my late husband. I had tended them for 20 years. They were the only living thing left of his memory, ripped out, replaced by gravel. "And the house, Julian?" I asked, my voice steady. "How is the house?" "It is great," he said, avoiding my gaze. Vanessa's mother, Brenda, repainted the living room. "It is a bright neon yellow now." She said the old beige was depressing. "They are throwing a lot of parties." "Mother, the Whitmans are very social. They have a big New Year's Eve gala planned." Vanessa is very excited. "A gala in my house, using my crystal, my linens, my kitchen." I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the thin pillow. "Go home, Julian," I said softly. "Are you okay, Maggie? Do you need anything?"
"No," I said.
"I have everything I need right here." When he left, I didn't cry. I had no more tears left for him. I stood up from my bed, my legs finally strong enough to carry me without a walker. I walked to the communal phone in the hallway. I had been saving my minutes, waiting for the right moment. I dialed a number I had memorized 30 years ago. Arthur Sterling. A deep, growly voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Arthur," I said, "it's Maggie Sullivan." There was a long silence on the other end. "Maggie, my God. Woman. I heard about the accident. I heard you were. I heard it was over." "It is not over, Arthur," I said, my voice like cold steel. "I am at Silver Pines. I need a lawyer, and I need a friend." "I will be there in an hour," he said. Arthur Sterling had been my late husband's best friend. He was a man of immense power in the state of Connecticut, a lion of the legal world, who had retired to a quiet life of luxury. But he had always had a soft spot for me, and he had always loathed Vanessa. When he walked into that dingy visiting room an hour later, his face contorted in a mask of pure disgust as he looked at the surroundings. "Maggie," he said, taking my hands, "what have they done to you?" I told him everything. I told him about the coma, the fake power of attorney, the deed transfer, the Whitmans, and the gravel pit that used to be my garden. I told him about Julian's silence and Vanessa's designer handbags. As I spoke, the air in the room seemed to grow cold. Arthur's eyes turned into flint. "They think you are a broken old woman, Maggie," he said. "They think the law is on their side because you are incapacitated. But they made a very big mistake. Vanessa is greedy, but she is sloppy. She didn't realize that your husband and I set up a secondary trust 20 years ago that she can't touch. And she didn't realize that a power of attorney signed under duress or through fraud is a one-way ticket to a federal prison. What do we do, Arthur?
I asked.
We wait, he said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. We wait until they are at their most confident. We wait until that New Year's Eve gala. You're going to stay here for a few more weeks, Maggie. You are going to continue to play the part of the frail, fading mother. Let them think they have one. Let them spend the money. Let them get comfortable in your beds. I looked at him, and for the first time since I woke up, I felt a flicker of warmth in my chest. It wasn't the warmth of love. It was the heat of a coming fire. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I had to endure the indignity of Silver Pines while knowing that freedom was just a few miles away. I had to look at Julian's guilty face and Vanessa's smug smiles during their brief visits. I had to listen to them talk about the Whitmans' plans for my house, as if I were already dead. One evening, Vanessa visited alone. She was wearing a new fur coat and smelling of expensive jean. She sat on the edge of my bed and looked at me with a cold, triumphant light in her eyes. You know, Maggie, I almost feel sorry for you, she whispered, making sure the nurses weren't listening. You worked so hard for that little house. You slaved away for Julian. And, in the end, what did it get you? A bed in a place that smells like a graveyard. Julian doesn't miss you. You know, he is relieved. He finally has a real family now. My parents love him. They don't judge him like you did. They don't remind him of how poor and pathetic his childhood was. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her, my face a mask of defeat. We are selling the house in the spring, Vanessa continued, leaning in close. Frank and Brenda want to move to Florida. We are going to take the proceeds and buy a penthouse in the city. Julian will be a partner at the firm by then. We won't have to worry about you anymore. The state will take over your care once your savings run out. It is a clean break, Maggie. I looked at the photograph of little Julian on the nightstand. I remembered the night he had the croup, and I had stayed up for 48 hours holding him in the bathroom with the steam running, praying to God to take me instead of him. I remembered the way he used to hold my thumb when we crossed the street, and I looked at the woman who had stolen his soul. I hope you're happy, Vanessa, I whispered. Oh, I am, Maggie, she said, standing up and smoothing her coat. I am very, very happy. As the door closed behind her, I stood up and walked to the window. The first snow of December was beginning to fall, covering the gray world in a blanket of white. I thought about my garden, buried under the gravel. I thought about the master suite, filled with the Whitmans' cheap belongings. And I thought about the fire that was coming. Arthur visited me every few days, bringing documents for me to sign in secret. He was working behind the scenes, freezing accounts, tracing the fraud, and building a cage for Vanessa that she wouldn't see until the door slammed shut. He found out that she had been stealing from my retirement fund to pay for her parents' debts. He found out that the deed transfer had been notarized by a cousin of hers who had a history of disciplinary issues. Everything is ready, Maggie, Arthur said during his final visit before Christmas. The Whitmans have sent out the invitations for the gala. They have invited the mayor, the local press, and all of Julian's biggest clients. They want to show off their new status. They want to prove they belong in Ridgefield.
And Julian? I asked. He is a ghost, Maggie.
He does what he is told. He is signing papers he hasn't even read. He is an accomplice whether he likes it or not. I felt a pang of grief, but it was distant now. I had spent my life protecting Julian from the world, and in doing so, I had failed to teach him how to protect himself from the monsters inside it. On the night of December 31st, the temperature dropped to 10 degrees. Inside Silver Pines, the heaters groaned and rattled, barely keeping the chill at bay. The nurses were distracted, celebrating in the break room with cheap, sparkling cider. At 8 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up to the side entrance. Arthur was driving. I walked out of that building for the last time. I didn't take anything with me. I left the cracked photograph of little Julian on the nightstand. That boy was dead. The man who had replaced him didn't deserve my memories. I was wearing a black silk dress that Arthur's wife had picked out for me. It was elegant, powerful, and fit me like a second skin. My hair, which had grown long and white during my time in the coma, was swept back into a sophisticated bun. I looked in the vanity mirror of the car and didn't see a victim. I saw a judge. "Are you ready, Maggie?" Arthur asked.
"Drive," I said.
As we drove through the snowy streets of Ridgefield, I saw the familiar landmarks of my life. The grocery store where I used to buy Julian's favorite cereal, the library where we spent Saturday afternoons, and then finally we turned onto my street. My house was ablaze with light. Dozens of expensive cars were parked along the curb. I could hear the faint sound of a jazz band playing in the backyard where a heated tent had been set up. The front door was decorated with an ostentatious gold wreath. Arthur parked the car a block away. We walked toward the house, the cold air stinging my lungs, but it felt like life. It felt like reality. We stood in the shadows for a moment, watching the guests arrive. I saw Vanessa's parents, Frank and Brenda, standing in the foyer, greeting people with the practiced arrogance of the newly rich. Frank was wearing a tuxedo that was a size too small, and Brenda was dripping in jewelry I knew had been bought with my savings. "They look comfortable, don't they?" Arthur whispered. "They won't be for long," I said. We walked up the driveway. The gravel pit where my garden used to be crunched under my feet. It was a cold, harsh sound. I looked at the house I had loved, the house I had bled for, and I felt a sense of detachment. It wasn't my home anymore. It was a crime scene. We reached the front door. The music was louder now, a festive melody that mocked the destruction inside. I reached out and touched the gold wreath. It was plastic, cheap, just like everything Vanessa had brought into my life. I looked at Arthur. He nodded and pulled a thick folder from his coat. The legal documents, the warrants, the evidence of a daughter-in-law's greed and a son's cowardice. "Let's go inside, Maggie," he said. I took a deep breath. I thought about the 4 months of darkness. I thought about the smell of bleach in the hospital. I thought about the cold moans of the dying in Silver Pines. And I thought about the son who had watched it all happen and said nothing. I pushed open the door. The foyer was crowded with people. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, high-end gin, and the desperate smell of social climbing. No one noticed me at first. I was just another guest in a black dress. I walked into the center of the living room, the room that was now a garish neon yellow. The jazz band was playing a fast-paced tune, and people were laughing, clinking glasses, and admiring the modern renovations. Then I saw him. Julian was standing by the fireplace, holding a glass of scotch. He looked miserable. He was staring into the flames, his back to the room. Vanessa was next to him, her arm draped over his shoulder, like a predator claiming its kill. She was talking to a group of Julian's clients, her voice loud and commanding. And then she turned. Her eyes swept across the room, and for a second, she didn't see me. But then her gaze locked onto mine. The glass in her hand slipped, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass cut through the music like a gunshot. Vanessa's face turned from a flush of excitement to a ghostly, sickly white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked as if she was seeing a demon. "Maggie," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. The room began to go quiet as people noticed her reaction. One by one, the guests turned to look at the woman in the black silk dress standing in the center of the room. Julian turned around slowly. When he saw me, he collapsed against the mantelpiece, his face contorting in a mask of pure terror. "Mother," he gasped. What are you doing here?"
"You should be."
"You're supposed to be." I walked toward them, my steps slow and deliberate. The jazz band stopped playing. The silence that followed was absolute. "I am supposed to be where, Julian?" I asked, my voice calm and clear, echoing through the halls of my house. "Am I supposed to be in the coma? Am I supposed to be in the grave? Or am I supposed to be rotting in that cage you call Silver Pines?" Vanessa finally found her voice, though it was shrill and desperate. "Maggie, this is an outrage. How dare you show up here like this? You are mentally unstable. Julian, call the facility. They have let a patient escape." Julian didn't move. He was staring at me, his eyes filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, holding the folder. "I don't think anyone is calling the facility, Vanessa," he said, his voice booming. "But I think several people might be calling their lawyers. Who are you? Frank Whitman shouted, stepping forward from the crowd, his face red with indignation. This is my house. Get out before I call the police. Your house, Frank? I asked, looking him in the eye. I don't remember selling it to you. I don't remember signing a deed. I don't even remember meeting you before you moved into my bedroom and ripped out my husband's garden. Vanessa lunged toward me, her face twisted in rage. You signed the papers, you old hag. Julian and I have the power of attorney. We have the legal right to do whatever we want with your assets. You're nothing. You're a liability. I stood my ground, looking at her with a pity that made her flinch. I didn't sign anything. Vanessa, and the power of attorney you used was a forgery. Arthur has the proof. He has the records of the accounts you emptied. He has the testimony of the notary you bribed. And he has the warrant that was signed an hour ago by a federal judge. The guests began to murmur, a wave of shock and disgust rippling through the crowd. Julian's clients were backing away, their faces filled with horror. Julian, do something. Vanessa shrieked, grabbing his arm. Tell them she's lying. Tell them we did it for her. Julian looked at her, then at me, and finally, he looked at himself. He looked at the expensive suit, the gold watch, and the yellow walls of the house he had helped steal. He slowly pulled his arm away from her grasp. It's over, Vanessa, he whispered. Over, she roared. It's not over. We have the money. We have the house. Arthur opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Actually, Vanessa, you have nothing. All the accounts have been frozen. The deed transfer has been nullified, and the police are currently waiting in the driveway to take you and your parents into custody for fraud, elder abuse, and embezzlement. Vanessa looked at the front door. At that moment, 3 police officers walked in. The blue and red lights of their cruisers reflected against the snowy windows. Frank and Brenda Whitman were the first to be Kong. They were led out of the house, screaming and cursing, their garish jewelry clinking against the metal. Vanessa was next. She didn't scream. She just stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred as the officer snapped the handcuffs around her wrists. Julian was left standing by the fireplace. He wasn't Kong Tai. Not yet. The officers were waiting for my signal. Mother, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had let me rot in a warehouse of the dying, so he didn't have to face his own weakness. You knew, Julian, I said. You just didn't care enough to stop it. I turned my back on him and walked toward the window. I looked out at the gravel pit that used to be my garden. The snow was falling heavily now, burying the stones and the cheap plastic wreath and the remnants of a life that was gone. Arthur walked up behind me. What do you want to do with him, Maggie? I closed my eyes. He is an architect, Arthur. Let him go and build a life that isn't a lie. But tell him to stay away from Ridgefield. Tell him he doesn't have a mother anymore. I stood there for a long time, watching the guests flee into the night, watching the police cars drive away, and watching the house fall into a deep, silent darkness. I was 65 years old. I had my house back. I had my savings back. But as I looked at the yellow walls and the empty foyer, I realized that I had finally woken up, not just from the coma, but from the illusion of the life I thought I had. I walked to the front door and pushed it open. The cold Connecticut air rushed in, clean and sharp. I stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the winter sky. The first part of my journey was over. The betrayal had been purged. The revenge had been served. But the rebirth was only just beginning. The house remained quiet for 3 days after the arrests. The police had cordoned off the property for a brief period to collect the last of the forensic evidence, and Arthur's team had been working through the night to formalize the return of my assets. I stayed at a nearby hotel, a place of wood and warmth that didn't smell like silver pines. Arthur had recommended I stay away until the house was professionally cleaned, but I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to see the damage. I needed to begin the exorcism. I arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I had stood in the center of that garish living room. The snow had melted into a gray, slushy mess, mirroring the state of my emotions. As I walked up the driveway, the sound of the gravel pit Frank Whitman had installed crunched under my feet again. It was an invasive sound, a reminder of the months of occupation. I stood at the front door, my hand trembling as I inserted the key. This time, the lock was mine. The house was mine. But as the door swung open, the scent of Vanessa's perfume still lingered in the air. A ghost of the woman who had tried to erase me. I walked through the foyer and into the living room. The neon yellow paint was even more offensive in the morning light. It looked like a scream on a canvas. I ran my hand over the mantelpiece, where I used to keep my collection of vintage porcelain. It was empty. Vanessa had likely sold them or hidden them in a storage unit. I looked at the walls where my family photos used to hang, showing a young Julian and my late husband, David. Now there were only empty hooks and pale rectangles of the original beige, paint peeking through the yellow. I walked into the kitchen. The stainless steel appliances were smeared with fingerprints, and the sink was filled with dirty glasses from the gala. Vanessa's parents had lived like royalty in a kingdom they hadn't earned. I opened the pantry and found it stocked with expensive wines and gourmet snacks I would never have bought for myself. I felt a surge of nausea. Every item in this house, every coat of paint, every shattered glass was a testament to the lack of soul that had moved in while I was asleep. I spent the first few hours in a daze wandering from room to room. In the master suite, I found Brenda Whitman's floral robes still draped over my bed. I pulled them off and threw them into a black trash bag. I stripped the silk sheets Vanessa had bought and added them to the pile. I opened the windows wide, letting the freezing Connecticut air rush in to push out the stale scent of Jean and entitlement. I didn't care if the pipes froze. I needed the house to breathe. Arthur called me at noon. "Maggie, how are you holding up?" "I am cleaning, Arthur," I said, my voice sounding more like myself than it had in months. "I am purging the rot." He chuckled, a warm, supportive sound. "I have some news. Vanessa's bail was denied this morning. Her parents are still in custody as well. The state prosecutor is looking at 20 years for the fraud and the elder abuse charges. They found a series of offshore accounts where Vanessa had been funneling your retirement savings. It seems she had been planning this long before your accident." I sat down on the edge of the bed, my legs feeling heavy. "Long before the accident, Arthur?" "Yes," he said. "They found emails dated a year ago. She was researching the process of declaring you incompetent. She was looking for a facility like Silver Pines. Even then, she just needed a catalyst. The truck on the I-95 gave her exactly what she wanted." I hung up the phone and stared at the empty wall.
A year.
For a whole year, while I was inviting her to dinner and buying her birthday gifts, she was measuring the dimensions of my coffin. She was looking at my son and seeing an easy mark. And Julian, did he know? Did he see the darkness and choose to look away? The thought of Julian was a dull, constant ache in my chest. I hadn't seen him since the night of the gala. He had sent several messages begging for a chance to explain, begging to see me. I hadn't replied. There was nothing left to explain. He had watched them wheel me into a van and drive me to a warehouse of the dying. He had watched them rip out David's hydrangeas. He had stood in the foyer and greeted guests while his mother was being handled by overworked orderlies in a room that smelled of death. I spent the next week with a team of painters and landscapers. I hired the most aggressive crew I could find. I wanted the yellow gone by nightfall. I watched as they scraped the paint from the walls, revealing the soft, neutral tones I had chosen with David 20 years ago. I watched as a backhoe moved into the driveway, scooping up the gravel pit and hauling it away. I sat on the porch as they brought in a truckload of topsoil and several dozen mature hydrangea bushes. They weren't the ones David had planted, but they were a promise of the spring to come. By the end of the second week, the physical house was restored. The yellow was gone. The gravel was gone. The furniture I had managed to recover from a storage unit Vanessa had rented was back in its place. The foyer smelled of lemon oil and fresh pine. But as I sat in my living room, looking at the familiar beige walls and the restored family photos, I felt a deep echoing loneliness. The house was mine, but it felt like a shell. I had spent my entire life building this for Julian, and now the thought of him sitting at my table felt like a violation. One afternoon, as the sun was setting behind the hills of Ridgefield, a car pulled into my driveway. I recognized the sound of the engine. It was Julian's sedan. I stood by the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I watched him get out of the car. He looked older than he had a week ago. He was wearing an old sweater I had bought him for Christmas 3 years ago. He stood in the driveway looking at the fresh soil and the new hydrangeas. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He walked to the front door and rang the bell. I didn't move.
He rang it again. "Mother, please," he called out.
"I know you're in there. I just want to talk. Just 5 minutes." I've chug. I walked to the door and opened it, keeping the security chain in place. I looked at him through the gap. He looked broken. His eyes were red and his hands were shaking. "Mother," he whispered. You look like yourself again." "I don't feel like myself, Julian," I said, my voice cold and flat. "I feel like a woman who is buried alive by her own son." Julian collapsed against the doorframe, his face contorting in pain. "I didn't know, Mother. I swear I didn't know about the emails. I didn't know Vanessa had been planning it. I thought we were helping you. I thought the Whitmans were the family I never had. Vanessa said you were happy. She said Silver Pines was a luxury facility. And you believed her?"
I asked.
"You saw the peeling paint and the grimy windows and the moans of the dying, and you thought I was happy. You saw your father's garden ripped out and replaced by gravel, and you thought I was being helped." Julian lowered his head. "I was a coward, Maggie. I was so afraid of losing her. She told me I wasn't enough. She told me I would never be a partner without her parents' connections. She made me feel like I was nothing without her. And I was so desperate for her approval that I let her destroy you." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the boy I had raised. I saw a man who had sold his soul for a lie. "Julian," I said, "your fear cost me 4 months of my life. It cost me the memory of your father. It cost me my trust in the world. I don't care about the house anymore. I don't care about the money. I care that you watched me drown and didn't even reach out a hand." He reached out and touched the door, his fingers trembling. "I can make it up to you, Maggie. I can help you with the garden. I can help you with the legal stuff. I can be the son you deserve." I slowly began to close the door. "No, Julian," I said, "you can't. You can't unring a bell. You can't unbury. I am 65 years old, and I have realized that the only person I can trust in this world is myself. Arthur will handle the final paperwork. You will receive a formal notice. I am removing you from my will, Julian. I am taking back the peace I gave you." "Mother, please," he cried, his voice breaking into a sob. "Stay away from Ridgefield, Julian," I said. "Go and build your architecture. Build your skyscrapers and your penthouses. But don't you ever come back to this house. This house is a sanctuary for the living, and you are a ghost." I closed the door and turned the lock. The sound of the deadbolt clicking home was the most satisfying thing I had ever heard. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I looked out the window and saw his car backing out of the driveway. He was gone. The exorcism was complete. The months that followed were a time of quiet, steady restoration. I spent my mornings in the garden, working the soil with my bare hands. I planted a new row of hydrangeas, white and blue and deep purple. I planted a small herb garden by the back door. I sat on the porch and watched the spring birds return to the Connecticut hills. I felt my strength returning, a slow tide of energy that I hadn't felt in decades. I was no longer a yeet NIH who waiting for the end. I was a woman reclaiming her story. Arthur visited me every Sunday. We would sit on the porch and talk about the world. He told me about the legal battles that were still ongoing. Vanessa had tried to claim that I was mentally unstable during the gala, but Arthur had countered with a series of psychiatric evaluations that proved I was as sharp as a needle. The state had formally charged her with 15 counts of felony fraud. The Whitmans had been sentenced to 10 years each. Vanessa was facing 15. They were gone. The rot had been removed. "Maggie, you look radiant," Arthur said during one of our final meetings. "What are you going to do now?" I looked out at the garden. The hydrangeas were in full bloom, a sea of color against the fresh green grass. "I am going to live, Arthur," I said. "I am going to travel. I am going to see the parts of the world I missed while I was pulling double shifts. I am going to buy a small apartment in the city and spend my winters there. And I am going to enjoy every second of the peace I earned." One afternoon, a package arrived from New York. It was a thick envelope with Julian's return address. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single letter and a check for $50,000. The letter was short. "Mother," it read, the firm. "I have moved to a small town in upstate New York. I am working as a freelance designer for low-income housing projects. It is not much, but it is honest. This check is the first installment of the money I owe you. I know it will never be enough. I know you will never forgive me. But I need you to know that I am trying. I am trying to be a man you wouldn't be ashamed of. I won't come to Ridgefield. I will respect your boundaries, but I will keep sending the checks. I will keep trying." I looked at the check. $50,000. It was a fraction of what they had stolen, but it was a start. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel joy. I felt a distant cold respect. Julian was finally learning the lesson I had failed to teach him. He was learning that the right thing is rarely the easy thing. I didn't cash the check. I put it in a drawer with the letter. I didn't need the money. I had Arthur and the trust David had set up, but I kept it as a reminder. A reminder that even in the darkest soil, something small and honest can begin to grow. As the first anniversary of the accident approached, I decided to throw a small gathering of my own. I didn't invite mayors or clients or press. I invited Arthur and his wife, the nurses from the local clinic where I used to volunteer, and a few neighbors who had stood by me during the recovery. We sat on the porch and watched the sun set. The air was warm, and the scent of the hydrangeas was thick and sweet. Arthur raised a glass of wine. "To Maggie Sullivan," he said, "the woman who came back from the dead to remind us all what justice looks like." We all clinked glasses. I felt a sense of profound, quiet victory. I looked at the house, the beige walls, the craftsman details, the open windows. It was no longer a crime scene. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was just a house. And I was no longer a judge or a victim. I was just Margaret Sullivan. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I walked out to the edge of the garden. The hydrangeas were glowing in the moonlight. I stood by the spot where David's original bushes had been. I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The past was gone. David was gone. The boy Julian was gone. But I was here. I was standing on my own land, breathing the cool night air, and looking toward a future that was entirely mine. I walked back to the house and stood on the porch for a moment. I looked at the dark hills of Connecticut and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the arrests or the nullified deeds. The greatest revenge was the fact that I was still here and I was happy. I had refused to let their darkness extinguish my light. I had refused to let their greed define my worth. I walked inside and closed the door. I didn't turn the deadbolt. I didn't need to. The house was safe. The exorcism was over. I walked into the master suite, the room that had once been stripped and violated, and lay down on the bed. The sheets were clean and white and smelled of the Connecticut wind. I closed my eyes and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep-up. I wasn't waiting for a miracle. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was just living. And in the quiet halls of my craftsman home, that was more than enough. Justice is a quiet flame that burns brightest when the world thinks it has been extinguished. Reclaiming one's life is not about the restoration of physical objects or the punishment of those who caused the pain, but about the refusal to let the shadows of betrayal define the remaining light of one's journey. I had to face the ultimate horror, the betrayal of my own flesh and blood. To realize that the strongest sanctuary is not built of wood and stone, but of a soul that refuses to be broken. Forgiveness is a personal choice, a gift you give yourself to stop the cycle of resentment. But it does not require a seat at your table for those who stood by while you drowned. True rebirth is finding peace in the silence, standing tall in the ruins of the past, and knowing that your dignity is the only asset that can never be stolen. Reclaiming the garden was a promise to myself that even after the harshest winter, spring always returns to those brave enough to plant. The rain in Connecticut during the month of October does not just fall. It is a slow, deliberate punishment, a cosmic correction for summer's hubris. It seeps into the mortar of old stone walls and the marrow of old bones, whispering of decay and the long, gray slide into winter. That Tuesday evening was a masterpiece of the genre. The sky wasn't just overcast, it was a leaden dome, pressing down on the rolling hills of Ridgefield, making the colorful leaves look like desperate, final flames about to be snuffed. In my silver sedan, a car chosen for its reliability, not its flair, I felt the familiar preemptive ache in my knuckles, a symphony played by 40 years of nursing, lifting patients, gripping bed rails, washing my hands raw under harsh hospital lights. I was 65. The frantic, beautiful, exhausting sprint of raising a child and building a career was over. The baton had been passed. Ahead of me lay the peace of a quiet house, of a garden sleeping under mulch, of books waiting on a shelf. I had earned it. God, how I had earned it. My sanctuary wasn't grand, but it was mine. A craftsman bungalow, all sturdy beams and mullioned windows, perched on an acre that sloped gently down to a whispering creek. Every shingle represented a holiday shift worked so Julian could go to soccer camp. Every pane of glass stood for a pair of shoes I didn't buy, a restaurant meal I skipped. The house was my autobiography in wood and stone, the final, solid chapter. Then, the lights. Not headlights, but apocalyptic orbs of white, shredding the liquid darkness of the storm-slicked I-95. The semi was a leviathan, a steel nightmare freed from its lane. There was no drama, no prolonged cinematic screech. Just a terrible, concise physics, the scream of tortured metal, the shocking whump of the airbag, a violent kiss of powder and fabric, and then a deep, cold quiet, seeping in like black water. As consciousness bled away into a hazy red tunnel, my final thoughts were not of my life, but of its stewardship. Julian, the spare key is in the blue porcelain vase. The hydrangeas need one more deep watering before the frost. Don't let the memories dry up. The void that followed was not nothingness. It was a sensory deprivation tank of the soul. For 4 months, I was an anchor lodged in the deep, dark seabed, while the world shimmered, distorted, far above. I felt the tides of medication ebb and flow. I heard sounds as if through a wall of ocean, the mechanical sigh of the ventilator, a cruel metronome, the rustle of starch-stiff uniforms, the cold, clinical touch of latex, and sometimes a warmth, a hand holding mine, a familiar, slightly trembling weight.
Julian.
You're here. Hold on, I'm right here. But the warmth would inevitably recede, chased away by a sharper, more insistent sound, the staccato click-click-click of high heels on linoleum. A sound that carried with it the cloying scent of expensive perfume and a voice like syrup over arsenic. Vanessa. Even in the depths, my spirit recoiled. Waking was not a gentle sunrise. It was a violent excavation. Light was a scalpel lancing my eyes. The hospital room's sterile whiteness was a blinding nullity. My body was a foreign, leaden object. And there he was, my Julian, framed by the grimy window, hunched over the glowing rectangle of his phone. He looked ravaged. But as my fogged vision cleared, I saw the truth. The shadows under his eyes weren't from vigil-keeping. They were the hollows of a man rotting from the inside out with a secret. His burden wasn't grief. It was the corrosive, ever-present weight of guilt. His reaction to my choked sound confirmed it. No cry of joy, no frantic embrace. He stood as one would approach a dangerous, unpredictable animal. "Mother," he whispered, the words sounding alien. "You're awake." The water he gave me was tepid, tasteless. His voice was flat as he recited the facts. For months. But his eyes screamed a different story. Vanessa's entrance was a performance. Swathed in a trench coat worth more than my first car, clutching my vintage handbag like a trophy, she was a vision of gaudy vitality in that room of death. Her smile was a slash of red lipstick. Rising from the dead, she chirped, the blasphemy casual. And then, with a breathtaking, surgical cruelty, she laid it all out. The hard decisions. The mounting bills. Her parents' convenient misfortune. The logical choice. The words deed transfer hit the sterile air and seemed to suck all the oxygen from it. My home. My sanctuary. Given away, while my heart still beat in this broken body. Julian's silence was the loudest betrayal. He stared at the floor, a little boy waiting for a scolding to end. We thought you were dying, he finally mumbled, a pathetic mantra. Vanessa said it was the only way. They were a united front of desecration. Vanessa, the architect, Julian, the cowardly foreman. They presented my exile to Silver Pines not as a condemnation, but as a merciful next step. A lovely facility. I knew it. Everyone in town knew it. It was the antechamber to the grave. The transfer was a clinical, humiliating procedure. Loaded into a van like freight, I watched Vanessa's gloved hand wave from the curb, a queen dismissing a servant. Silver Pines was worse than rumor. It smelled of boiled cabbage, urine, and hopelessness. My room was a ward. My bed, a narrow cot. On the nightstand, a single, cruel artifact from my old life, a cracked photo of a smiling boy with a soccer trophy. It wasn't a comfort, it was a taunt. I became a student of my own annihilation. I watched the autumn bleed into a bitter winter from my grimy window. I ate the mush. I endured the rough, impersonal hands of overworked aides. I listened to the symphony of loss around me, the moans, the confused cries for long-dead mothers. And I healed. My body, resilient from decades of hard work, knitted itself back together. My spirit, however, entered a state of cold, deliberate hibernation. I was a seed in frozen ground, waiting. Julian's monthly visits were exquisite tortures. He talked of the weather, of work, of Vanessa's happiness.
He never asked about me.
He was a ghost reporting from the land of the living. And he brought news of the final erasures. Frank ripped out the garden. Too much maintenance. He put in a gravel pit. Each word was a pinprick to my heart. Those hydrangeas were from David. I'd nurtured them for 2 decades. They were roots, memory, love made floral, replaced by sterile, crushing stone. And the house? I'd ask, my voice dangerously calm. Great. Brenda painted the living room. Neon yellow. Cheerful. A gala was planned. A New Year's Eve celebration in my home, with my things, for her people. The day he told me that, I finally understood. The boy in the photograph was gone. The man before me was a collaborator. Go home, Julian, I said softly, my voice the quiet click of a lock turning. I have everything I need right here. When he left, I didn't weep. I stood. My legs, stronger now, carried me to the communal phone. I dialed the number that was a lifeline to a past self, to a time of loyalty and strength. Arthur. It's Maggie Sullivan. The gravelly voice on the other end held a world of shock and sorrow. Maggie, my God. I heard. I thought it was over. It's not over, Arthur, I said, and my voice had the timbre of cold-forged steel. It's just beginning. Arthur Sterling was more than a lawyer. He was an avenging angel in a Savile Row suit. My late husband's best friend, a legal titan who'd seen every form of human venality. His disgust when he saw me in that place was volcanic. As I poured out the story, the forged power of attorney, the fraudulent deed, the theft, the garden, his eyes turned to chips of flint. They think you're a broken old woman, he rumbled. They think the law belongs to the ruthless. They've made a catastrophic error. He outlined their sloppiness, the secondary trust they couldn't touch, the fraud that was a federal offense. Then he laid out the plan. We wait, Maggie. We let them reach the pinnacle of their confidence. We let them throw their party. You will be the ghost who comes to the feast. The subsequent weeks were an act of supreme endurance. I played my part flawlessly. The fading, defeated mother. Vanessa visited alone once, swathed in new fur, drunk on gin and triumph. She leaned close, her breath sour with victory. You know, I almost feel sorry for you. Julian doesn't miss you. He's relieved. She spoke of selling the house, buying a penthouse, leaving me to the state. Her hatred was a tangible thing. I am very, very happy, she hissed. As the door closed, I stood at the window. The first snow was falling, a pure white shroud over a filthy world. I thought of my garden, buried. I thought of my bedroom, defiled. And I felt it, not rage, but the calm, focused heat of a coming fire. Arthur was building the cage, document by document. Vanessa was stealing from my retirement to fund her parents' life. The notary was a corrupt cousin. The trap was set. New Year's Eve. 10 degrees. Silver pines groaned with cold. At 8 p.m., Arthur's black SUV glided to the side door. I walked out. I took nothing. I left the photo of the dead boy behind. Arthur's wife had provided a black silk dress. It was armor. My white hair was swept up. In the mirror, I didn't see a patient. I saw a reckoning. Driving through Ridgefield was a journey through my own ghost. The library, the grocery store, the turn onto my street. And there it was, my house, a blister of light and noise in the silent, snowy night. Cars lined the curb. Jazz music spilled from a heated tent in the backyard. The gold wreath on the door was cheap, garish. We stood in the shadows, watching. Frank and Brenda Whitman held court in the foyer, dripping in jewelry bought with my life's work. They wore my home like a cheap suit. They look comfortable, Arthur whispered. Not for long, I replied. The crunch of the gravel pit under my feet was the sound of my own resurrection. I pushed open the front door. The scene was a grotesque parody of everything I loved. The neon yellow walls assaulted the eye. The air was thick with vanity and ambition. Julian stood by my fireplace, a glass in his hand, staring into the flames with the blankness of a hostage. Vanessa was draped on him, holding forth to a cluster of his clients. Then she saw me. The glass fell from her hand. The shatter silenced the room. Her face drained of all color, leaving a mask of pure, superstitious terror. Maggie, she croaked. All eyes turned to me. Julian whirled, his expression collapsing into abject horror. Mother, you're supposed to be. Where, Julian? My voice, clear and cold, filled the sudden silence. In the coma? The grave? Or that warehouse you bought for me? Vanessa found her voice, shrill and desperate. She's unstable. An escapee. Arthur stepped forward, a patriarch with a scroll of judgment. I think the only people calling their lawyers tonight will be you, Vanessa. Frank Whitman blustered forward. This is my house. I looked him in the eye. You live in a forgery. You sleep in a crime scene. The unraveling was swift and merciless. Arthur laid out the evidence, the fraud, the theft, the federal warrants. The police, waiting in the driveway, stepped in. Frank and Brenda were let out, sputtering and cursing, their gaudy finery looking suddenly pathetic. Vanessa went silently, her eyes locked on mine with a hatred so pure it was almost awe-inspiring. But she was already gone. Then it was just Julian, trembling by the fire. Mother, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't think. I looked at the man my son had become. You knew, Julian. You just didn't care enough to stop it. I turned my back. Arthur, let him go. He's an architect. Let him build a life that isn't a lie. But tell him he doesn't have a mother anymore. The aftermath was a quiet apocalypse. I purged the house of their presence. The yellow paint was scraped away, revealing the gentle beige bones of my real life. I hired a crew with backhoes. They ripped out every last piece of gravel. The sound of it being hauled away was a healing melody. I replanted the garden. Not as a replica, but as a promise. New hydrangeas, their roots seeking deep into the cleansed earth. The act of planting, of tending, was my true therapy. It was an argument with entropy, a daily vote for life. Julian came once, a specter at my door. He offered explanations, tears a check. I saw the hollow man, terrified of his own emptiness. "You can't unbury someone, Julian," I said, and closed the door. The click of the lock was a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Arthur kept me updated. Vanessa faced decades in prison. The Whitmans, a lesser but substantial sentence. The money was restored. The trust secure. But true victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the silence of my reclaimed home. It was in the peace that settled over me, not as a gift, but as a hard-won prize. I realized they had stolen an idea of my life, the house, the security, but they could never touch the core of who I was. My dignity was not an asset on any balance sheet. It was the immutable core of my being, and it had remained intact. One day, almost a year later, I stood at the edge of the garden. The hydrangeas were a riot of blue and purple, swaying in a warm breeze. Arthur and a few real friends were coming for dinner. Not a gala. A supper.
Simple, honest.
True rebirth, I understood now, is not a dramatic flair. It is the quiet, daily act of finding peace in the silence you once feared. It is learning to stand tall, not in spite of the ruins around you, but because you have surveyed them, acknowledged their reality, and chosen to build a new right there amidst the wreckage. It is the profound, unshakable knowledge that your self-respect is the one fortress no betrayal can ever breach. Reclaiming the garden was that final, sacred promise to myself. It was proof that life insists on renewal. That after the most punishing winter, after the ice, the neglect, the burial under crushing stone, spring does return. But it only returns to those brave enough to plant, to kneel in the wounded earth, to cradle a fragile root ball, to believe in a bloom they may not see for seasons to come. It is the ultimate act of faith, to invest in a future, not because you are guaranteed to see it, but because the act of planting itself is a declaration that you are still, irrevocably, on the side of life. I am Maggie Sullivan. I was punished by the rain, shattered by metal, betrayed by blood, and discarded in a place of shadows. But I planted, and in the rich, dark soil of my own resilience, I am finally, deeply blooming.